Equality is a term that is used frequently, yet rarely examined with any real rigor. Throughout human history, it has served both as a rallying cry for revolution and as a cornerstone of institutional design. However, when equality is endlessly invoked without a clear definition, it often shifts from a moral ideal into a political instrument, and can even become a rhetorical cover used to justify conflict and division. In modern society, discussions about equality tend to remain at an emotional level. People are inclined to treat their personal feelings as the standard of judgment, while overlooking the fact that different forms of equality can come into conflict with one another. Without a shared foundation of understanding, equality loses its ability to function as a genuine public value. For this reason, before we can meaningfully discuss equality, we must first unpack the concept itself. We need to understand how it is misused, and under what conditions equality can truly serve as a principle that advances justice, rather than one that produces new forms of injustice. Hi everyone, I'm Eric, a cat who dreams of becoming a philosopher. This is the place where I share my thoughts and explore new ideas with you all. So let's dive into today's topic. Many people claim to be fighting for equality, yet very few are willing to take responsibility for defining it in objective terms. As a result, equality becomes an empty but highly mobilizing word. Anyone can wrap their own demands in the language of equality without having to explain where its reasonable limits lie. When a concept retains emotional force but loses rational constraint, it becomes easy to appropriate, and even to turn against its original purpose. When equality lacks a clear definition, it is no longer a claim that must be argued for or justified, but a moral position assumed to be self-evidently correct. Invoked in the name of equality, opponents are easily portrayed as cold, unfeeling, or even as standing on the side of injustice. This linguistics grants equality an almost immune status in public debate, making rational questioning increasingly difficult. Under such conditions, the pursuit of equality often ceases to be about correcting unjustified differences and gradually turns into a tool for securing additional resources and institutional protection. If a group can successfully present itself as a victim of inequality, it may gain preferential treatment within distribution systems, treatment that itself is no longer subject to scrutiny under the principle of equality. In this way, equality stops limiting privilege and instead becomes a justification for creating it. Taken further, when different groups advance competing claims to equality without any shared standard for comparison, institutional design is forced to rely on political power and rhetorical mobilization rather than coherent moral or rational principles. Over time, equality deteriorates from a public value into a linguistic weapon in a zero-sum contest. Whoever generates the strongest emotional resonance gains the strongest claim to resources. In the absence of an objective definition, equality is constantly reinterpreted to suit the political needs of different moments and factions. A concept originally meant to challenge injustice is repurposed to legitimize favoritism and exceptions. This not only undermines the predictability of institutional allocation, but also steadily erodes public trust in fairness itself. Equality that no one defines does not resolve injustice. It produces new forms of it. It conceals how privilege is created, allowing unequal distributions of resources to appear morally justified. When everyone pursues their own interests in the name of equality, the inequalities that genuinely require correction are more easily overlooked or sacrificed. If we refuse to establish objective and defensible standards for equality, so-called equality movements will ultimately devolve into competitions over who can most convincingly frame their interests as moral necessity. Equality itself then loses the very constraints and persuasive force that once gave it meaning. In the long run, society no longer debates which inequalities might be justified, but merely competes over who deserves compensation most. Public discourse shifts from institutional design to emotional mobilization, and institutions are driven to respond to short-term pressure rather than maintain long-term stability. Once equality loses its boundaries, it no longer restrains power. It becomes a tool for power's expansion. When equality is treated as a principle of institutional design, the crucial issue is not the goodwill of intentions, but the clarity of boundaries. Once an institution commits itself to equality, it is also committing public authority and public resources. Equality, therefore, cannot remain an emotional slogan. It must operate as a rule-based framework with defined limits. Without boundaries, institutions cannot determine when intervention is required and when withdrawal is appropriate, and will instead be drawn into endless cycles of response and compensation. In this context, necessity and non-voluntariness become the core conditions for judging whether a situation warrants equalizing intervention. Necessity does not refer to whether a difference feels unfair, but to whether the right being claimed is of irreplaceable importance. In other words, without intervention, would the individual be excluded from basic social participation, with no reasonable alternative means of redress? For example, if a person is excluded from an entire industry due to factors beyond their control, they are effectively deprived of a particular form of livelihood and social role. In such cases, equalizing measures have clear necessity. By contrast, if someone is merely unable to enter a specific firm, where that firm is neither the sole gateway to the industry, nor structurally decisive, then even if differential treatment exists, the necessity for institutional intervention is weak. Here, what is at stake is not structural exclusion, but the outcome of individual competition. Necessity, therefore, functions as a boundary-setting principle for equality. It requires institutions to act only where non-intervention would result in fundamental exclusion, rather than treating all undesirable outcomes as injustice. Equalizing measures that lack necessity not only blur the role of institutions, but also weaken their legitimacy when intervention is genuinely required. Running alongside necessity is a condition of non-voluntariness. This refers to whether an individual's disadvantage arises independently of recent decisions made with adequate information and meaningful choice. This criterion matters because it directly affects whether responsibility is misallocated within institutions. If outcomes voluntarily accepted through risk-taking are also compensated in the name of equality, the consequences of personal choice are shifted onto society as a whole. When non-voluntariness is not clearly distinguished, institutions gradually replace individual judgment as the ultimate bearer of risk. People come to expect that outcomes can be redistributed, which in turn alters incentives at the point of decision-making. This misplacement of responsibility weakens accountability and encourages choices that are high risk yet low in efficiency. Over time, such risk transfer inevitably places heavy strain on public resources. When equality measures are not constrained by necessity and non-voluntariness, resources are increasingly spent correcting avoidable outcomes rather than addressing disadvantages that individuals genuinely could not choose. Ultimately, institutions struggle to remain sustainable, and equality shifts from a means of correcting injustice into a source of new injustice itself. Equality of outcome is bound to fail at the institutional level, not merely because it is difficult to implement, but because it systematically reinforces class rigidity through the way resources are allocated. When institutions treat compensating outcomes as the primary objective, resources are no longer directed towards promoting mobility, but towards maintaining a surface-level balance. The long-term effect is the entrenchment, rather than the loosening of existing class structures. Under the logic of equality of outcome, resources are allocated mainly on the basis of group labels rather than individual ability and potential. Large amounts of support are directed towards members of disadvantaged groups who lack either capacity or motivation, not to enable class transition, but simply to ensure that their outcomes do not fall too far behind. At the same time, capable individuals from non-privileged backgrounds, often at critical stages of upward movement, struggle to access support because they do not fit recognized categories of disadvantage. These individuals have not yet accumulated sufficient capital, yet must bear full competitive pressure, and are effectively excluded from institutional assistance. As a result, the very forces most capable of disrupting entrenched class structures are systematically suppressed. This misallocation of resources directly produces class rigidity. Low-capability individuals within disadvantaged groups are indefinitely sustained by institutions, but lack both incentives and conditions to move beyond their original position. Meanwhile, capable individuals outside privileged categories are trapped in a stagnant middle ground, unable to move upward and gradually seeing the returns on effort erode. Class thus ceases to be a condition that can be overcome and becomes a classification actively stabilized by the system. Quality of outcome also amounts to exploitation of the capable. When institutions deny the legitimate influence of ability differences on outcomes, the rewards generated by skill, effort, and risk-taking are treated as resources to be continually redistributed. Capable individuals are not only prevented from retaining the returns on their contributions, but are also required to bear the ongoing cost of compensating others. As the link between effort and reward weakens, incentives decline, and overall productivity suffers. Furthermore, equality of outcome leads to substantial waste of resources. Institutions continually invest in adjusting outcomes while neglecting the processes through which ability is formed, preventing resources from generating long-term value. The expansion of bachelor's degrees offers a clear example. When possession of a degree is treated as an expected outcome, education systems are pressured to keep increasing degree supply. Yet, wider access to degrees does not produce corresponding gains in capability. Instead, degrees lose their signaling value, and credentials once used to identify competence become devalued. Vast amounts of time and public resources are consumed, without any meaningful improvement in professional capacity or social efficiency. In sum, equality of outcome misallocates resources in ways that simultaneously entrench class rigidity, exploit the capable, and waste public resources. When institutions adjust numbers without changing structures, equality not only fails to materialize, but becomes a barrier to mobility and a source of new injustice. After rejecting equality of outcome, equality of opportunity is often seen as a more practical and rational alternative. It does not require everyone to reach the same endpoint, but instead holds that institutions should ensure a common set of rules for competition, allowing outcomes to reflect genuine differences. Yet, the frequent failure of equality of opportunity in practice does not stem from a fundamental flaw in the principle itself, but from the long-standing neglect of the structural consequences of accumulated outcomes. The core assumption of equality of opportunity is that if each round of competition is formally fair, then the resulting outcomes are legitimate. In reality, however, social competition is not a single event, but a chain of repeated contests. The resources, experience, reputation, and connections gained from each success naturally translate into advantages at the starting point of the next competition. When institutions allow this conversion to extend without limit, early successes are continually amplified, eventually producing disparities that are extremely difficult to reverse. It is through this process of repeated accumulation that equality of opportunity gradually loses its substantive function. Even when institutions nominally provide identical rules and procedures, later entrants are rarely able to compete on genuinely equal terms with those who already hold advantages. Competition remains open in appearance, but in practice, outcomes are often heavily shaped by prior achievements before the contest even begins. Career attainment offers a clear illustration. Access to high-reward or high-impact professions is typically preceded by multiple rounds of accumulated advantage long before formal entry into the labor market. Family background, educational quality, early performance, and social networks often complete several layers of selection in advance. If final occupational position alone is taken as the benchmark, genuine equality of opportunity scarcely exists in this domain because competitors begin from fundamentally different heights. This does not mean, however, that equality of opportunity is doomed to fail. The core issue is not whether achievements should be recognized, but whether institutions mistakenly treat the accumulation of outcomes as a natural and untouchable process. When outcomes are allowed to convert indefinitely into future opportunities, equality of opportunity collapses into a merely formal claim rather than a substantive institutional arrangement. By contrast, if institutions impose boundaries at key points in the accumulation process, such as limiting the decisive impact of early advantages on later opportunities, or preserving pathways for those who have not yet completed accumulation to re-enter competition or change tracks, equality of opportunity can recover its capacity to promote mobility. Such adjustments do not deny achievement itself. They prevent achievement from becoming a gatekeeping mechanism that closes competition. For this reason, managing how outcomes accumulate and reducing their locking effect on future opportunities is not only the central challenge facing equality of opportunity, but the key to realizing equality in institutional terms. Once outcomes no longer automatically translate into monopolistic advantage, equality of opportunity can stand as a viable and sufficient answer to equality at the level of institutions. When equality is treated as an unconditional moral command rather than as an institutional principle that must be constrained and designed, the pursuit of equality can itself turn into a process that generates injustice. This transformation does not arise from the ill intent of individual actors, but from the structural consequences of institutions repeatedly and persistently intervening in the formation of differences and the distribution of outcomes without clear criteria. Across the cases discussed above, whether it is equality that no one defines, equalizing measures that ignore necessity and non-voluntariness, or redistribution systems centered on outcomes, institutions commit the same fundamental error: differences as injustices that must be corrected. When institutions refuse to distinguish between legitimate differences and illegitimate exclusion, equality ceases to restrain power and instead becomes a justification for intervention, even a moral force driving continual institutional expansion. Equality of outcome produces injustice by misallocating resources, entrenching class structures, and weakening the link between ability and reward. Unadjusted equality of opportunity, by contrast, allows accumulated outcomes to solidify early advantages into structural barriers. Although these approaches appear opposed, they share the same consequence. Institutions drift away from promoting mobility and instead stabilize, or even reinforce, existing distributions, making social strata increasingly difficult to penetrate. More concerning still, when equality becomes the primary or even the sole source of legitimacy for institutional action, it gradually loses its capacity for self-restraint. Every new grievance can be reframed as a new inequality. Every act of compensation becomes the starting point for the next demand. Institutions are thus drawn into a self-reinforcing cycle, lacking clear conditions of completion and unable to determine when intervention should end. Within such an institutional environment, those who really bear the cost are often not the highly visible and formally recognized disadvantaged groups, but individuals who are neither classified as disadvantaged nor sufficiently advantaged. They face both competitive pressure and redistributive burdens, yet receive little institutional protection or compensation. Over time, they become the group most easily overlooked by equality policies, and the most likely to lose trust in the system. Institutions act in the name of correcting injustice, yet in practice continuously generate new imbalances and resentment. In the long run, when equality is used to respond to every difference, setback, and failure, society gradually loses its ability to distinguish between responsibility, choice, and risk. Injustice is no longer treated as a problem requiring precise identification and definition, but as an abstract concept that can be endlessly expanded. At this point, equality not only fails to advance justice, but undermines institutional sustainability and erodes social trust in fairness itself. For this reason, unless equality is redefined with clear conditions, boundaries, and mechanisms of self-limitation, the pursuit of equality will ultimately betray its original purpose. Only by understanding equality as a constrained, testable, and completable institutional principle, rather than an infinitely extensible moral demand, can equality avoid becoming a force that produces injustice in practice. The question has never been whether equality should be pursued, but whether it is given clear boundaries. Once equality loses definition and constraint, it no longer corrects injustice and instead becomes a justification for unlimited institutional intervention. A workable conception of equality does not seek to erase all differences. It seeks to ensure that no one is permanently excluded from basic social participation due to non-voluntary and unavoidable conditions. Only by acknowledging difference, responsibility, and limits can equality avoid betraying justice in practice. That's all for this video. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Every like, subscribe, and comment are a contribution to solving those difficult questions. I look forward to your joining our discussion and making a contribution to solving the difficult questions. Once again, thank you for your watching. Goodbye!